At the COP26 Climate Summit on Monday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced 2070 as the target for India to reach net zero carbon emissions. India's announcement came as a surprise to delegates at the climate talks in Glasgow, as it had rejected calls to announce such a target only last week. Environment Secretary R.P. Gupta had argued that it was more important for the world to lay out a pathway to reduce emissions than just achieving carbon neutrality. A net zero target refers to the date by which point a country will only emit carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that can be absorbed by forests, crops, soil, and developing technologies like carbon capture technology. Rich nations like the US, the UK, and Japan, as well as the European Union, went for a 2050 goal, whereas China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia have set targets of 2060. But as a developing country, it is more difficult for India to do away with fossil fuels like coal. As the world's third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, next only to China and the US, India is also among the countries most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. According to the Global Climate Risk Index 2021, published by the think tank Germanwatch, India is the 7th most affected country by extreme weather events. India's goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2070 may seem far-fetched. But to support this goal, Prime Minister Modi made 4 other aggressive pledges, all of them to be achieved by 2030. The Prime Minister said that in another 9 years, India would increase the share of renewables in its energy mix to 50% from about 38% last year. He also raised the target for installed capacity of renewable energy to 500 gigawatts by 2030 from the previous 450 gigawatt goal. India's current renewable energy capacity stands at 175 gigawatt. India will also reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by 45% from 2005 levels, up from the previous commitment of 33 to 35%. Emissions intensity refers to the volume of emissions per unit of GDP. And finally, the Prime Minister said India would reduce its projected total carbon emissions by 1 billion tons by the end of the decade. India emitted 2.62 billion tons of CO2 in 2019, and it is projected to reach 4.5 billion tons in 2030. Given this context, India's target is quite considerable.
We heard just yesterday Prime Minister Modi announce 5 aspects of India's ambitions to tackle climate change. While the 2070 target of net zero will probably get a lot of headlines, more interesting are short-term ambitions by 2030, which is just 9 years away, less than a decade away. Some of these are not necessarily new. So for example, 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel electricity is not much more than 450 gigawatts of renewables that was announced primarily with wind and solar. So if you count hydropower as renewable as well, this is still not too different from what was being planned, but at the same time, it is extremely, extremely ambitious. Today, India's wind, solar, and other RE, excluding hydro, is about 100 gigawatts. So we want to add at least 300, maybe more, 350 gigawatts in the next 9 years, which is extremely, extremely ambitious. Not that it can't be done with the right amount of money, but A, there's that first if, but B, managing that, integrating that will require a lot of changes into our electricity system. And at some point, we will need viable storage technologies. Some of the other targets, we don't have enough details on. So for example, the 1 billion reduction in emissions, benchmarking that is very important. If we do accept an emissions intensity improvement, that is also quite dramatic. India was on track, of course, for its 33 to 35% improvement, which was the earlier pledge. So India has ratcheted up its ambitions, and now 45% will mean we'll have to go beyond the power sector. And this is probably the biggest shift that's going to happen. The earlier targets were very electricity centric. Now we're talking total system or total energy, and that is where it's a lot harder to actually decarbonize. One of the big unknowns is how this would treat non-commercial energy. We use a lot of biomass for more traditional uses, especially cooking. How will that evolve? Because that was anyways slowing down or winding down. So these are big changes. We will have to electrify more industries, and this may give a push a need to drive clean industrial processes, including eventually a shift over to hydrogen. 2030 is too near for all of that to happen. And so the 2070 benchmark really gives us a long-term ambition, which will have to be broken down into parts and stages.
However, in order for India to achieve its ambitious targets, it will have to make substantial changes to its coal-reliant power sector. According to Bloomberg NEF data, more than 70% of India's electricity came from coal power plants last year.
To meet the target of reaching 500 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity by 2030 would mean adding solar, wind, large and small hydro, biomass and waste to energy power generation at a rapid pace. India currently has 100 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity and close to 40 gigawatt of hydropower. This would also mean that there needs to be a large-scale investment in battery storage and transmission infrastructure to support the growth of renewable energy in the country. To meet the other target that the Prime Minister announced, that 50% of India's energy demand is supposed to come from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030, would mean greening of several sectors, especially mobility, domestic gas usage and manufacturing. This means that India would need to invest in production and also adoption of several green fuels such as hydrogen, methanol, natural gas, etc. Officials, however, pointed out that in the near term, the future of coal and thermal power production in the country is certain. That at least for the next 2 decades, coal production in the country would continue, and so would thermal power, till the time renewable energy sources take over and lead to an eventual decline of conventional fuel sources.
India still has to frame a comprehensive plan for the 40 years from 2030 to deliver on its goal of carbon neutrality. But what underpins the progress on this issue is money. PM Modi called on the wealthy countries to contribute $1 trillion in climate finance to developing economies. This, even as a promised $100 billion in annual climate finance, is yet to be delivered after developed countries promised in 2009. Consider that in 2018, the government said India would need $2.5 trillion to achieve its 2030 climate change targets under the Nationally Determined Contributions or NDCs agreed at the Paris Climate Accords.
Prime Minister Modi announced India's updated climate commitments, including 2030 targets as well as 2070 net zero target. Climate finance will play a significant role in achievement of these particular goals, specifically the near-term. In order for India to achieve its future goals, updated goals of 2030, we will need additional access to the climate finance. For example, the MSME sector, which has been lacking the access to the finance, would need greater access if India were to achieve its updated NDC goals. It is important that the climate finance flows from developed countries to the developing world continues to flow and are scaled up commensurate with the level of investments required to counter the climate change impacts which we'll be observing due to the temperature rise that is likely to happen by the end of the century. Well, India in its first NDC asked for $2.5 trillion of climate finance to implement the goals under the first NDC. We are yet to see the detailed document, so we still don't know what the climate finance requirement would look like in the updated goals. But it would obviously be in addition to the already existing numbers which are out there.
Time alone will tell whether India will succeed with its ambitious targets or not. For now, however, it's clear that India has taken on more than its fair share when it comes to combating climate change.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.